Alright, today we're going to talk about making baguettes. Baguettes, French bread. What we're making is not a whole lot like what you get in the store. This marked as French bread. This is a little more rustic. It's a lean bread, which means that it's flour, salt, water, and yeast. Don't have eggs, milk, butter, anything like that. Alright, I actually started this last night with a pre-ferment. What we call a Poolish because it's very liquid. Poolish, when you're working with bread, when at all possible, time is your ally, so use it well. This is the Poolish from last night. So what I've got is 210 grams of all-purpose flour. I could also use bread flour. 210 grams of cool water and a pinch of yeast. I use instant yeast. There are different kinds you can use, but I would not recommend using rapid rise because it works fast and then dies out, so you don't get the flavor. I'm going to add to that for the final dough here. I've got 490 grams of flour, 7 grams of yeast, 14 grams of salt. Salt strengthens a dough. Some people use kosher, which is larger granules. I would recommend weighing it rather than going by volume, just for that reason. Some people say that they can taste the iodine in iodized salt, so that is your call whether you use that or not. Personally, fancy bread salts really don't do anything for me. Himalayan salt is just someone's getting your money. So mix in the dry parts first. Then put in the pre-ferment. Again, see how bubbly it is. The yeast has really been working there. 10 to 15 hours on that should be sufficient. And top it off with about 270 grams of water. I use filtered water because the water out of my tap is well water and it's about hard enough to chip your teeth. Again, to some extent water is water, but prefer not to use chlorinated. Anything that's been treated that can cause problems with your microflora, which you're trying to be good to your yeast here. This is a very wet, sticky dough. Depending on the conditions in your house, you may need a little bit more water, you may need less. Something you can do is pour most of that water in, start mixing it, and then decide whether you want to add the last bit. Alright, so now I'm going to turn out this very sticky mess. Get my dough scraper here. If you don't have a dough scraper, that's fine. Just use whatever you have in your kitchen. But dough scrapers are very nice. I've got a couple of them that I use. You can get a dough scraper for somewhere between $5 and $10 probably. If you're doing a lot of baking, I would certainly recommend it because I use it a lot. Most every time that I do any kind of baking, I use one. Sometimes I use two, but one's fine. Alright. Now, what we're doing, you've got several proteins that are being broken down by the water. And mixing them around puts two of those proteins together and to form what we call gluten. The gluten is what makes the dough sticky, and it creates fibers that when the dough starts filling with air, rather than letting the air come through, it just expands into little bubbles. That's what makes the dough rise. If you have a gluten allergy or following a gluten-free diet, then this is not the bread for you. There are gluten-free alternatives, but honestly, I've never used them. Pretty much anything with the wheat in it is going to cause you issues. All right, you see, hopefully, that it's still very sticky, but it is getting a little tighter. And what I may do, although is not recommended, is put a dab of flour in there. The reason you don't ordinarily want to put flour into the recipe is because that changes the recipe. Everything ideally has been put together at the right amounts, but I put a little too much water in there, so it's not coming together. So let me just put a little more flour in there. Not enough so that I have to add any salt, but enough to make it a little less sticky. Now for a very wet dough, it's a very light dough, very wet dough. So what I want to do now is kind of folding, where kind of flip it out like that, roll it over, then go over here on the left side, lift it out, flop it down again, and just keep doing that. What that's doing, a couple things. One, it is mixing and strengthening the dough. Two, it is rolling some air in there. It's folding in air, which the yeast is going to use in its respiration, and make it easier to rise. My bread teacher taught me how to do this. Would fold it 100 times or more. This one I will probably have to do something like that. And it is firmed up considerably, but it's still very sticky. So again, from the left, and you have to keep it moving. So come in from the left, throw out, roll up, and just keep doing that, cleaning up under it occasionally. So, and that's incorporating air. Scrape. It's a very tactile sort of exercise, feeling the dough in there. Bread making's alchemy. You take some powders, some water, thyme, and a little bit of elbow grease here, add heat, and get something that is utterly unlike the bits that you put in. So it's it can be a very meditative sort of practice. Someone can get lost in it. It can certainly be calming. And it gives you a sense of accomplishment when you're done. Yeah. See how it's really firmed up? I mean, it's still sticky, but it is coalesced very well as the dough gets stronger. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to leave the yeast to its own devices. Yes, much better. Okay. I'm going to put it in a bowl. You can spray some oil in there if you want, but that's hardly necessary. I put it in there and I will cover it up. You can use plastic if you want. I usually just use a bowl and then put some, maybe put a cloth on top of it. Just you don't want air moving around in there and drying things out. So we're going to leave it here, let it do its thing for about an hour and a half of rising. Halfway through, I'm going to pull it out and fold it a couple times. Just take the ends and put them over each other. Maybe do that little folding flip like I was doing. But that'll be about 45 minutes in. And from there, the rest is up to the yeast. Time has passed. We let it sit 45 minutes. Then fold it and then sit for 45 more minutes. Then I brought it out and pre-formed it. I cut it into 4 pieces and put it in a bowl and just let it sit for about 20 minutes. And now we're going to shape it into an actual baguette. You want to be fairly gentle with the dough at this point. You don't want to take out too much of the air that's in it. We'll flatten out just a little bit, pat it down. And then fold about a third over, kind of like you're folding a letter. Add it a little bit. Do that again. Over, fold, pat it down a little bit. All right, then, and I usually want to do this towards me, but since I'm in the way, I'll do this towards you. Put your thumb in, fold over, like that. Turn it over. Just push in a little bit, fold over a little bit, and pinch it shut. We're talking probably about yay wide is about the length that this baguette will be. So to get this right, you don't want to push it and pull like that, and roll gently in the middle. So it flattens out a little bit, not much, very gentle. And you put the other hand in there, and with the hand cup, not pushing down much. Roll it back and forth like that until you get it about what you want. Ends here, I like to have them kind of pointy because it's nice and crispy. I like that. It's my favorite part of the bread. What I've got here is called a kosh. It is made from flax. You don't have to use something like this. All that you really need to do is to have something that kind of keeps the bread towards in the shape that you need it to be in. Gently put it over here, and then fold that over. It's a fairly stiff canvas. Do the same here. It's still a very sticky dough. Sometimes you're more sticky than other times. where the scraper here comes in very handy. I've been making bread for probably my first bread. It was actually French bread. I made it using a Betty Crocker recipe, and that was back in 1994, and it made an excellent doorstop. So, in other words, it was not edible. I started making decent edible bread a couple years later, and I really got into it probably 2005 or thereabouts. And I got a couple of good books teaching how to do this. This particular recipe, for Father's Day, this I was given a horse with King Arthur. Not to plug them, but although they are good. And they taught me how to do this. It took my bread making to a different level. Taught me some really good tricks and confidence to actually make bread. That's a little more fancy than what I had been making. I don't remember how much one of these cloths cost, but it's not a lot. But again, you don't need the cloth to make bread. Really, you don't need much to start, apart from the ingredients. You make, if you get bowls, you can get some bowls cheap. And the pastry scraper here, the dough scraper, didn't cost a lot, but you don't even need that. It's just terribly useful. One of the things about the flax here is you never wash it. Washing it ruins it. But you can clean it off. But really, up to a point, the more flour you get on there, the more, I guess, kind of seasons it. So I'm being pretty gentle with it, not mashing it over much, just patting it a little bit, pushing and folding. The folding that we're doing here is supposed to tighten the skin on it. You've got the skin, you can see some bubbles popping up. That helps it with spring up later. Now, we'll cover this up, spray some water on it just to keep it nice and moist, and leave it go for about 30-40 minutes. And the oven I will heat up to about 500 degrees. All right, so the time has passed, and they've gotten a little bit bigger, so that's good. All right, now you want to be really careful. You don't want to mash them at all at this point, so be very gentle. I typically use parchment paper. You don't have to, but I would use something, cornmeal on the bottom or something to keep it from sticking. And I use a peel. That's this thing, but you don't have to. You can put it on a cookie sheet if you want. And these guys are going to be too long, but you can wing it. Fold around if you want. And it's going to be your bread. Do what you want with it. It's going to taste good regardless. All right. Then you'll want to score it. Put slashes on it. That breaks the outer sheath of the hardened dough here, and that will allow it to expand when it's in the oven. You want to slash it in about half an inch, maybe to an inch. You can use a sharp knife. You can use pretty much anything with an edge. I just happen to use a razor blade because they're cheap. And because this is a particularly wet dough, it's still kind of sticky. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to boil about a cup of water. I've got the oven up to 500 degrees, and underneath the stone that I'm going to put the bread on is a pan that's I'm going to have the boiling water. You'll want the boiling water because it creates steam, and that will help the bread rise more. It'll give it some time where it's still elastic before the crust starts hardening off. Let it go for about 25 minutes. Keep an eye on it. All right. Now, one of the things that is really fun with baguettes, as they cool, within a minute or two after they come out, they start to crackle. And I like to just kind of lean forward and listen to them crackling. When I took the baking class, there was maybe 10 people there, and all the baguettes, when they made them, brought them out, it was like rain falling. It smells good too. These are pretty dark. I personally like them that dark, nice, caramelized. The sugars that are released from the flour when the yeast gets to work in there, that's what gives it that dark crust. And they're nice and crunchy on the outside and very tender on the inside. You don't have to get them this dark, but I particularly like them just like that.